Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with baritone saxophonist, bass clarinetist, and cool cat Josh Stinton. He opened up about his 2018 CD, the first album from his Predicate Trio. It is his 10th recording as a leader, and this New Jersey native studied composition at the University of Chicago and carved a formative niche for himself in the Windy City, writing and performing music for dance and theater. After some world travel, he moved to Boston in '99 to go to the New England Conservatory, and then he went on to move to his Mecca, New York City in 2004. He's been there ever since. So please get to know him and dig this interview, my friends.
Josh, hey, thanks for taking a minute out for Neon Jazz.
It's my pleasure.
So I want to dive right into this latest album that you put out with your trio. Give me an idea of what you were going for. What were your artistic vision with this album was?
I mean, it's interesting that you start off with that question because with pretty much every other record I've made, I'd be able to answer it pretty succinctly and clearly. And this one, not so much, simply because, last year I very unexpectedly, at least on my side, at the beginning of last year, kind of publicly announced a indefinite hiatus. I had to take some time out for my health and had some issues that I really needed attending to, and I wasn't going to. I just needed to take a big step back. There were, of course, because of the suddenness of it, some things that I had planned for in the fall of 2017. And one of the things that I had planned on was to document the work I'd been doing with Chris Hoffman and Tom Rainey. And so they're very busy guys. And so like in around October or November of 2017, I'd asked them, hey, can you guys leave some time open around like end of May or June, because I'd like to see about, just recording what we've been working on. At that point, we had done about 5 shows together over the previous year and a half or so. And as the time came closer for the date that they had reserved, so this is around March, I announced a hiatus in January, and then around March of 2018, I was like, should I do this or not do this? And actually my wife, my amazing and long-suffering wife who I've been with a long time now, I asked her if I should do it or not, given that I was not feeling really ready to return to business as usual. And she very smartly said, I actually think you should, even though you don't feel ready for it, because knowing your associates the way I do, I know if you don't record them now, you probably won't ever be able to get them together again in the future because schedules just won't coincide. Things just won't line up. And so I just decided, okay, I'll just go ahead and just document like whatever we have. And I, at that point, like I'd written just a small number of pieces for us, about 4 pieces that I'd written for us, 4 or 5 pieces. And then we'd also done a bunch of freeform pieces as well. That was my only plan. And actually the idea of what the personality of the record, as I think of it, what the record was about, didn't come to me until about the second or third tune on the day of recording. So as we just went, I set up a show and a rehearsal, and we did all that. And then when we got to my friend's recording studio, we started recording some takes. And by like the third piece in, I was finally in the back of my head kind of figuring out what this album was and what it was about, at least to me. So it's a very different record for me in that way, in that every other record I pretty much had everything planned out from start to finish before I got to the studio.
Was that refreshing for you to kind of do something totally different?
I guess, I don't know, maybe refreshing, scary, because just going into it, I wasn't sure if it was such a good idea for me to be documenting this. I'm kind of mortally terrified of putting useless information out into the world because like everyone, I'm constantly bombarded by that now and spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to put up filters so I don't have to ignore things quite so much, consciously ignore things. So I always want to make sure whenever I put something out that it's something that's meaningful to me and that there's a compelling reason to me for putting it out. So it was kind of scary at first because I was kind of worried, is this just like a total vanity project and is this a pointless exercise? So it was unique. I don't know if I'll do something that way again. Maybe. I mean, I did find that I got certain results from the recording that I have not gotten from previous things, which was it's been interesting both to see my reaction to it and also kind of everyone else's reaction to this record as compared to some of the other things that I've done.
Let me get back to the beginning of your life here. You were born and raised in New Jersey. Talk to me about how you got into jazz and kind of what your childhood was like, even like early jazz albums you listened to.
Okay, yeah. I don't know how many of your listeners have actually been to this part of the country. I actually have a small experience of Kansas City just driving through. I lived in Chicago for 10 years back in the 90s. So I have some experience in the Midwest, but the South Jersey where I grew up is very unique. There's a huge area of land there called the Pine Barrens. It's a big federal reserve set aside under Teddy Roosevelt's administration. It's about 1 million acres of scrub pine and sand. It's still that way. It's protected forests and wetlands, swamps. So it's funny that like in the most densely populated state in the country, there's this huge area in the southern part of it where very few people live. It's like this big empty swath of small pine trees and just nothing, and a couple of little rivers and swamps. So in some ways I kind of grew up in the middle of nowhere. There were no music programs or anything like that where I grew up. There weren't any like youth orchestras. There certainly wasn't any youth jazz programs or anything like that. But I did grow up as a self-described faculty brat. My dad was a college professor at a local college there. My mom she taught a little bit there, taught some intro anthropology courses, and then got her MSW, started working for family services, and then as a self-employed therapist. I definitely grew up with a fairly intellectually minded family. And my grandmother on my father's side was an abstract painter based out in San Francisco. So whenever we did go traveling, if it wasn't to go camping, it was to go to art museums. So I just grew up in a world where, I was regularly exposed to abstract art, and where, regularly I would encounter usually visual art, but sometimes also music. The same grandmother was also like an early and very avid supporter of the Kronos Quartet. So I was regularly being exposed to art where, if in response to the question, well, what's this about? I was always given the reply of like, well, what do you think it's about? So I just knew that was a thing out in the world, this like mysterious art. And in addition to this, my dad had a huge record collection at the time, took up this enormous wall of our house, several hundred, possibly 1,000 records. It was pretty varied. It was a lot of classical music, a lot of Bach and Beethoven and early Renaissance polyphony, things like that, but also a bunch of oddball rock as well as 60s rock. So like Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell were there, and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. But then my dad also would have like a whole bunch of like Frank Zappa and some Harry Partch and some Stravinsky and a couple of Charlie Parker records in there, and some old like stuff from the Smithsonian Folkways catalog. So particularly for the 70s and 80s, it was a pretty wide gamut. So music was just something that was always being played on the stereo at home all the time. And I became kind of obsessed with it, and kind of fascinated by it. I had 3 older brothers who were all really into music as well. So it was just a kind of a source of, outside of like food and books, it was something that was regularly like, and in camping, it was something that was regularly like discussed and done in my home. So I'm not entirely sure how it exactly happened, because everyone else in my family ended up becoming a scientist except for me. I just ended up pursuing it. I didn't have a jazz record. I really lucked out that my dad, he took out a subscription sometime in the 1980s to the Franklin Mintz Jazz History of Jazz series, which was a series of 25 box sets. Each box set was 4 LPs. They would arrive every 4 weeks at our doorstep. So for a little over 2 years, you would get these boxes. And when they first arrived, I had no interest in them. But a few years after they had arrived, I, started getting more curious about this section of my dad's record collection. And each one would have a theme. So there'd be one that would be like Origins of Jazz New Orleans. And it would be, two of those LPs would be like Louis Armstrong. But the other two would be like all sorts of New Orleans artists I didn't know at all, like Baby Dodds or King Oliver. People like that. And then like there'd be another set on like saxophone stylists, and that would be the first set of saxophone stylists. So it'd be like Benny Carter, Johnny Hodges, Lester Young, and Coleman Hawkins. And then like volume 2 of saxophone stylists would be like Sonny Rollins and John Coltrane and Cannonball Adderley and people like that. And then a whole other section on bebop. And so I just started making mixtapes for myself out of these box sets. I would pull out the records, and I had one of the benefits of not having much going on where I grew up. I had more than enough time to sit there and zone out in front of the stereo. And so I would just do these little drop the needle tests, and I dropped the needle on each track of each LP, and if I wanted, I'd let it play for about 10 seconds, and if I wanted to hear beyond those 10 seconds, it went on the mixtape. And I just started filling up tape after tape after tape after tape, and that became kind of a bit of a Rosetta Stone, because anything that really caught my ear, then I would, especially when I went off to college in the city, I went to college in Chicago, I started combing through all the used record stores, looking for either records that had really turned me on through this collection is how I found out about the record Kind of Blue, because one of the things it had on there is both flamenco sketches and all blues, and I loved both those tracks, so I found the record that they appeared on. But then again, through this box set, I found the name like Cannonball Adderley, and I would look for Cannonball Adderley records, and so it kind of went on like that, but with maybe a little more depth than some people might have gotten from other teachers. So like early on, I knew who Johnny Hodges was, or who Don Bias was, or even who Bud Johnson was, or people like that, because of this really kind of amazingly, still when I go back and look at my dad actually, even though he doesn't have a record player, he's held onto the box sets, and I still comb through them sometimes when I visit home, and they're amazingly curated. Some of the stuff they got in there is like fairly deep cuts, things that you would rarely see on like Best of Jazz or Intro to Jazz things, but that I think are incredibly informative about the tradition in a wider sense, and certainly it's been presented for the past 25 years.
So from Jersey, you move on to Chicago, then you go to Boston, and then you get to New York. What were those times between Boston and Chicago like that groomed you for New York, which is a pretty big thing?
Yeah. I think it groomed me for New York in the sense of, both in the sense of, I realized that I didn't want to stay in either of those two cities, and particularly in the case of Boston, I couldn't stay there because I couldn't find anyone to play with really at all, and so I had to get out of there. So I did not feel ready for New York, but by the time I moved here, I realized that was a myth, that I still to this day have some friends who have stayed in, particularly stay in Boston, but also stay in Chicago, because they're like, I don't know if I'm ready for New York. Like, no one feels ready for New York. And I've, in my life, met maybe 3 people who were explicitly invited to New York City by established artists here. So just to say, like, I don't know if one ever feels, some people maybe do feel groomed or ready for this place. I just felt like, okay, well, I think I've gone through the options that would make sense outside of New York. It was a long period of time. That covers from like 1989 till about 2004. So like my 20s through half of my 30s. It was interesting. Chicago, I went to a liberal arts college with no performing aspect to their music department. And while I did major in music there was no real ensembles for me to work in, and there were certainly no teachers employed there to teach instrumental technique. So I spent any free time I had in Chicago just going to clubs and sitting on jam sessions. I got really involved with the theater scene there as well, as both like an actor and eventually then doing sound design and composing music. Ended up working a lot with some of the choreographers I met in the city who were doing modern dance. So Chicago was really great in that respect, in that it was, particularly in the 90s, it was, and I think it's still pretty affordable comparatively speaking, but it's a super cheap place to live. So that left lots of free time for practicing, and lots of free time for just making mistakes, I guess, like spending too much, like wasting my time on this project or some bit of research that didn't work out. And at the same time, it was like, to buy lots of records and go to lots of concerts and things like that. I did reach a certain kind of limit in terms of, I realized that coming out of my college, I explicitly decided I was not only not going to graduate school, but I wasn't going to go to a conservatory or any kind of performance-based school, because I've read, I'm a fairly bookish type, so I had this idea that, okay, well, I can learn even more about how to play this music by reading books about it. And I did learn a lot. I don't know if I learned how to play music so much. That I learned by just playing. But one of the common strains you find in a lot of jazz biographies and jazz histories is this notion of learning outside of quote-unquote academia, learning on the proverbial street. And I thought, okay, I'll go and do that. And the issue I discovered, the problem I had personally with that, and at least in the 90s, was kind of twofold. One is that by the time of the 90s, like while rent in Chicago was cheap, it wasn't as cheap as it was, say, back even in the 1960s or 70s. So I still had to work, at least 30 to 40 hours a week at various jobs just to make my rent and, buy food and things like that. There wasn't nearly as much time for, I worked as hard as I could and would practice as much as I could, but I was lucky if I managed to get, say, 2 or 3 hours of, devoted practicing and studying of music in for a day. More often it was about an hour or something like that, because with traveling to work and things like that and trying to also be involved in having some kind of performing life, there just wasn't any time to do the research and woodshedding that I really craved at that time. And it was and I think it's fairly impossible for most people today, unless you're in some kind of special situation where you don't have to worry about your bills so much. Then the other thing I discovered is when I would go to jam sessions of almost any kind, that I would see groups of people who knew each other and I would get to know some of them, but I realized I didn't have a certain kind of connection with them, because basically almost all of them either had gone to some kind of jazz or music performance program with each other or were currently in one. And so I looked around and I realized I needed some time. I needed both the luxury of unlimited amounts of time every day to study and to shed, and also I really wanted to be surrounded by people who were as obsessed with music as I was. And the only place I saw where that existed were in music programs, in conservatories primarily, and in the occasional performance programs in liberal arts colleges. So towards the end of the 90s, I applied just to 2 programs. I applied to the master's program at Wesleyan and the master's program at New England Conservatory, and I got rejected by both. And then Ram Blake called me up, actually, and offered me a chance to do kind of a post-baccalaureate catch-up work at New England Conservatory, with the idea that if I did well in that, then they would reconsider an application for the master's program at New England Conservatory. And that seemed to be my only escape route, so I went and took that. So yeah, it was really different. And Boston was really a time of just hiding out, so to speak. I just basically was all about practicing all the time. That was the one period of time I was really lucky. I got a period of about 4 years there where I was able to practice an unlimited amount of time, and I figured out, I learned how I was practicing in inefficient and unhealthy ways, and also got much better and improved my ear a lot. Of the 5 years I was in Boston, 4 of them I was basically literally in a practice room. And I was one of those guys who I'd roll into school sometime between like 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. and I'd be there until they kicked me out sometime after midnight. And because I was in my late 20s, I knew I had a limited time there. I was taking out loans to be there, and so I was going into debt. I'm still paying off those loans now. And so I just looked at it as like, okay, I have this little window where I can practice to my heart's content and just work. Like, the only demands I have are the ones I place on myself. And so I took full advantage of that. I tried to study with everyone I could, tried to play with anyone who would let me play with them. And yeah, just, tried to get myself in a place where I would feel a little more confident about my own abilities and a little less, have a little more trust in what in what I was hearing and what I could do.
So you get to New York, and obviously you've hit the ground running. You perform with a lot of people, Darcy James, you, Steve Lacy. What have you learned from being around people that have had a lot of jazz mileage? What have they taught you? What advice have they given you?
It's an interesting question, just because I feel like, certainly compared to many of my peers, like I've only managed to, as far as like kind of seasoned players, like say of the, kind of like say Steve Lacy or someone like Tom Rainey or something like that. I've been really lucky to meet and play with a few of those people, but a very, very small number. Most of the more established or known musicians or more experienced musicians, at best what I've gotten is, occasionally to like hang out with them and pick their brains. As far as like actually talking about, I don't know, for lack of a better term, the life, it's a funny thing. You got to be kind of cagey about it, because there's always the danger that one's going to start complaining too much. And the last thing, which I totally understand now, I'm about 15 years in being in New York City, and if I meet somebody who's been here like 2 or 3 years, the last thing I want to hear from them is them complaining about how they don't have any work or are not getting a chance to play, because that's been my experience from almost the beginning here. And everyone has a different experience. I guess the thing I've gotten over the years is that, first of all, everyone has their own unique experience of making a life in the creative arts, and in this particular branch of creative arts. So I take everything with a grain of salt of, okay, well, this is their experience. I can learn from it, but it's not going to explain my experience, nor is my experience going to explain someone else's. So it times out differently for everyone. Some people arrive in the city and they're instantly welcomed with open arms, and they're working a ton, and a lot of people are calling them, and you're getting offers to play at all sorts of clubs, and getting asked to lead bands, things like that. Other people show up and they are really incredible musicians, but for one reason or another, no one ever really takes notice of them, and then they just kind of disappear into the woodwork. And other people, the vast majority of people come and they seem to have little flashes, little moments where they're working a lot, and then moments where nothing's going on, and it's a bit of a mystery. As far as like kind of, I don't know, I guess, the most valuable thing I've gotten from people outside of the difference of experience is the once in a while when I'm able to have a sense of camaraderie with someone, where, I can complain a little bit about what's going on in my life. They can complain a little bit, but then we can tell some jokes and it's funny, and then we can like share some information about like a book that we've read or a movie we've seen and have a good conversation. And for that particular moment, for that bit of time, we enjoy each other's company and time with each other. And that's probably one of the biggest things I've gotten, is like that sense of human connection with it. Because over about 2 years ago, I finally kind of came to grips with the fact that, from my standpoint, at least from my personal take on it, that here in America right now in the 21st century, playing creative instrumental music where there's some element, if not a lot, of improvisation in it, we're about as relevant to the wider culture as poetry is. And I'm a big fan. I read poetry. I really enjoy it. But, you know, like, I've understood for a long time that outside of a few people for that brief flash of like of slam poetry back in the 90s and early aughts, like, you know, if you wanted to feel like really on the outside of American culture, be a poet. You know, it's been true for, you know, over 100 years at least in this country. So that's been like a bit of a tough pill to swallow, because certainly when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, it didn't seem like this way of making a life was so obscure. And maybe it was, and I just didn't see it. But it somehow seemed like, I don't know, like, yeah, like, you know, particularly if you're just making music without always the use of a singer and with elements of improvisation, that was something that, you know, the wider public, not a huge, but a larger slice of the public could enjoy or like make sense of. And now I don't think that's the case.
So let me ask you this. One of the greatest teachers for us for live shows that we see, what was like the first jazz show you saw live that really moved you?
The first jazz show that really moved me. That's actually a tough one to say. I didn't get to start seeing concerts in general, but especially jazz concerts regularly until I was 17 and I had moved to Chicago. So, I mean, like I said, where I grew up, there were no performing venues really of any kind, and I was far enough away from any of the major cities that it was difficult to get permission for my parents to like take a bus. I do know that the first jazz show I saw when I got to Chicago was it was orientation week, when all the freshmen show up before everyone else shows up, and they'd organized, you know, so they organized all these events for the students to go and do, and it was in Chicago, and so they're like, well, you know, here they made a few token offerings. They're like, here, let's take advantage of stuff in the city, and one was a field trip for anyone interested to go to Joe Siegel's jazz showcase and go see Dizzy Gillespie's group. I don't remember who the rhythm section was, but I do remember that Ed Cherry was a guitarist. And I only remember that because a few years later about a year later, I discovered Henry Threadgill, and not long after that, Ed Cherry had started playing with Threadgill in Very, Very Circus. So that's a name that I've just always seen. But I remember going to see Dizzy Gillespie, and I don't know if I was moved by that concert, but I was certainly mystified by it. I mean, I was trying to kind of make sense of what I had seen, because parts of it were really fascinating, and in other times, and even as I recall it now, I got the sense of like, okay, this is not the most exciting concert I've been to. It seems like, you know, they're kind of doing their work here and everything. Musicians are doing their work and giving a show, but it's not the most, you know, it's not, they don't seem to be laying everything on the line. I think the first jazz show I saw that like, the first jazz that I started hearing that really kind of shook me was, there was a guy who I studied with who was kind of a satellite member of the AACM. He's still alive now. I think he lives up in Wisconsin, named Hannah John Taylor. And I remember hearing him play and just being completely mesmerized by what he was doing. It was kind of extraordinary. He's an incredible flutist, but at the time he was starting to play a lot more soprano saxophone. And then I think he plays a fair amount of tenor. His flute playing is still my favorite. And then hearing what he would do at jam sessions always amazed me. And not long after that, so this had been like by 1990, I'd managed to start going to some AACM things. So not long after that, I was hearing Fred Anderson, and then I got to be what do you call it? Not a chauffeur, but I'd helped assist with the 25th anniversary of the AACM with getting people to their seats, and doing all that. And in return, I got to stand there and watch the whole weekend of it. And in particular, I remember I got to see the Art Ensemble Chicago with all 5 original members. This was just before Jarman had left the group. And that has stayed with me. That will stay with me for the rest of my life. That was one of the most extraordinary things I'd ever seen. But that whole weekend of what I saw and experienced across the board was kind of amazing. Like the There would be jam sessions afterwards that the ACM guys would go and play, and observing that, hearing Amina Claudine Meyer's trio for the first time. There was a pretty stunning duo of Moo Hall, Richard Abrams, and George Lewis, where someone in the audience started like kind of hollering, like going, yeah, yeah, and like Moo Hall, Richard Abrams at a certain point, and they're playing for me, very abstract, hard to kind of reference music, because I hadn't heard enough music yet to really make sense of what they were doing, but I was still fascinated by it and fascinated by the textures. But it was very clear they were being very serious and focused about what they were doing. This wasn't like a hooting and hollering kind of music, but this guy kept hollering near the front row, and finally Moo Hall just stops playing, and he gets up and he goes to the very edge of the stage, and he peers at the gentleman, and he kind of bends down a little bit at the edge of the stage, and in a very serious voice he says, now you're going to stop that right now, and if you do not stop it, you will leave this hall immediately. Do you understand? It's all quiet. Just watching, I was like, oh my God, please don't say anything to him. Just shut up. And he said, okay, good. And then he went back and he sat down, and then they were just doing a free-form improvisation, and then they just restarted. They continued as if nothing had happened. And it was kind of a stunning thing to see that, like, okay, I might not understand what is happening musically here. I might not have the ability and at that point I didn't have the ability to hear what they were doing and articulating, but it was clear that they did, and that it meant something it had a very deep and important meaning to them, that it was about something and it was not to be taken lightly. So, I mean, this were probably like the early experiences. I had, in a way, like, I think it was probably a great way to start with jazz, and that some of my favorite stuff that I heard in those first couple of years of like 89 to at least through 93, a lot of it was just going to jam sessions and hearing other people blow my mind. Just seeing like some people who became well known, like Anthony Wansi, this incredible pianist when he was really young, or this kind of obscure but incredible tenor player, Lynn Halliday, who's passed now, but also like Cameron Fiffner, or people like that, or Von Freeman, and hearing these people, live and in person in a small bar, and kind of seeing it, and that's what stuck with me ever since, is that on a good night when you see these people, when you see a human being execute something like this, it's just like going to the circus or seeing some kind of old-fashioned, like, kind of silly human trick in a way. Like, you're kind of stunned by the capabilities of humanity at that point, that a single person or a group of people really can do this together, can synchronize and perform things in that kind of way. Because even when one can't hear what they're doing, like one can't necessarily parse out what they're saying, or, can't necessarily understand all the details of what's happening in your range of hearing, the feeling one gets from it, to me, is very akin to when I was a small child, like, get to once in a while go to an actual circus or something and be like, I can't believe someone can do that. Like, how do they do that? It's like the greatest kind of magic trick. So that was kind of a great thing in a way, because then, when I did, and a few years later, like, because I don't occasionally go to like the jazz showcase because that was expensive, but I would go to jazz showcase, and when I did get to see like later on like Johnny Griffin with the Washington Brothers, or Pharoah Sanders, or Charles Lloyd, or people like that, I was like, then it had this extra kind of resonance to it, based on, okay, I've seen people kind of toil away at this in the mind, so to speak, and I've seen people do their own take on it, but then to see someone who's executing it at that kind of level where you kind of understand, like, okay, even if I don't necessarily like this one song they do, or this approach or that approach, I still understand, I still have some sense of like how kind of magnificent the actual act is itself.
Absolutely. Yeah, without a doubt. So this is my final question. Everything's going to come down to this, and I want to know, everyone has a version or interpretation of you, your family, your friends, your fans, but you know who you are best. Who do you think you are?
Who do I think I am? I think, well, I know I am an American artist in all that implies, a European American artist. I know that not too many people understand at this point the art that I'm making. It's difficult. I mean, it's not, wasn't my choice, but at the same time, that's okay. And I know I'm a professional performer, that when people pay good money to come and watch me perform, I will give them their money's worth. That, even if they don't like everything I play or even much of what I play, that they definitely will remember it and they will not be bored. I know I am an eternal student.
That's great, man. That's a great way to wrap everything up. Hey, thank you for opening up about your world of music and your career. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure, Joe.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in New York, Chicago, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Josh for his time, his music, and his cool. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.